While drinking with his boss, I just told my husband, "Get your money up," but everyone took it bad. Hello, Reddit. My name is Anna, and I'm 32 years old. I'm a housewife and a mother of two kids. I live with my husband in our own house, but the mortgage payment takes most of what we have, and we barely survive on the rest. I need your advice, which is the reason why I'm here. My husband has been acting weird ever since the dinner party his boss hosted, and he took me along. Well, I kind of made a mistake during the party. Ever since, David has been acting weird and refusing to talk to me. I never got married to David out of love at first, but I did grow to love him, and I had always known that David loved me more than I loved him. David had always been in love with me from the beginning. We had grown as childhood friends and later as best friends, and I had always known about David's feelings for me, but I kept ignoring them because I hadn't wanted to be with him. To me, back then, David had been that guy in the background, never really in the main picture. He was the one I ran to when I had problems, whether in previous relationships or with life generally. He'd comfort me and help me get through rough patches. Once I was back on my feet, he was just a childhood friend to me again. We grew up as next-door neighbors because our mothers had been best friends since high school and coincidentally married two men who had no issues with their friendship. They built their houses side by side with the same design and decorations. In fact, they even set up a farming business together, which was quite successful. I never knew our parents to have any misunderstandings because of how tight their bond was, and we, David and I, were born into that, so we just fell into the path they already laid. But while David was laid back, calm, and gentle, always sticking to his carefully organized plans, I was the opposite. I was mischievous, always getting into trouble, and very spontaneous. We were more like opposites, and growing up I had always found David quite boring, so I did many things to get him in trouble so he could have fun, as I like to describe it. David had always been the studious type, so it wasn't a surprise when, after high school, he got a scholarship to study whatever course he decided. Meanwhile, I had to work extremely hard to even manage a place at the same university. David and I decided to share a house during our time in school, and I agreed. Despite our parents doing business together, David's dad had other businesses, which were also quite productive, so his parents were richer than mine, even though they never showed it off, which was what I loved about them most. In school, David continued his bookworm attitude and usually had one of the best grades in his department, but I was the party animal. There was no party I didn't attend, both the ones I was invited to and the ones I wasn't. I was the life of the party and grew really popular because of it. Although I never really hosted my own party, I did one time because David wasn't around. He had gone on a trip to see his parents, so I hadn't expected him back that day. David came back to find the house full of people, and he was so upset. I'd never really seen David angry in my life because he was never easily provoked, but he was so angry that day. He ordered everyone out of the house and warned me never to bring my parties into our house as long as we shared it. I apologized the next day, but David had already gotten over it. After that, I never hosted a party at our place again. My grades were really bad for the first 2 years of school, and I knew that if I wasn't careful, I would eventually end up retaking some courses. So I asked David to help me with my courses, and he did. It was actually because of David that I was able to graduate. I got my first boyfriend in my final year. Jack was David's friend, and he was the one always trying to get David to chill. When he came to our apartment one day with David, we clicked immediately. We started hanging out even without David, and eventually we started dating. We were together for 3 months before I found out that Jack had gotten a girl pregnant and was ignoring her. When I confronted him about it, he lied that the baby wasn't his. I broke things off with him, and because of how he acted, David stopped hanging out with him too. It wasn't long before I started dating another guy, Steven. Steven was a newbie in school, but he was my age. According to him, he had to stay back home because of his family's financial situation. Steven was very cool, and what I liked about him, or should I say, what attracted me to him, was the fact that he was really handsome and had that bad boy vibe that every girl loves her guy to have. Despite being a newbie, he easily became popular among the girls, and the fact that he was with me made me the envy of most girls. But there was one problem with Steven. Steven was always collecting money from me, and at first I did not mind. David warned me against him, but I never had listened to David for once anyways. I kept spending all my money on Steven, but eventually I got to find out that he was also a serial cheat. He had been sleeping around, and when I asked him, he had told me he wanted to just explore, nothing more. I ended things with him and focused on my studies, and eventually I was able to graduate fine. I got a job 3 months after searching for one in a publishing company as an assistant editor. It was really stressful for me, having to read through various manuscripts and also edit them. But I still loved my job, except that my superior just liked giving me a hard time. He enjoyed seeing me slaving and taking all the glory, but I couldn't say anything. But eventually I just had to quit the job because of how frustrated I was. David helped me get another job in a company near his place, so I eventually moved in with him so I could save the money for transportation. Working there had been the worst experience because I got taken advantage of. I had wanted to prove to everyone that I could do well, including David, so I worked the hardest. And then my manager was always calling me into his office and praising me for jobs well done. He never praised me in front of others, though, and he said that was because he didn't want people thinking that it was nepotism, and I accepted it, thinking it was normal. The manager's name is Jim. Jim and I started dating a month after I started working there. We only met in secret, and we never had dates like other couples did because we mostly met when it was dark and at some random hotel of his choosing. But I liked Jim a lot. I was really in love with him, and I wanted more. But because of the rules of no dating colleagues at work, we had to keep our relationship to ourselves. I thought Jim loved me too. I mean, he did always tell me whenever we made love. He would tell me how much I meant to him and how he wanted me really badly. Well, he didn't exactly use the L word, but I felt like he did love me, so I hadn't minded he never told me he loved me. I kept our relationship a secret even from David. Whenever he asked why I was always late, I would just make excuses about my demanding job and leave it at that. I had an idea I had worked so hard on, and it had been almost perfect. I even asked David to help me with some designs because he was an architect, and he had gladly helped me with them because he had seen my pitch and had been proud of the idea I developed. So I told Jim about the idea I was working on, and he had been happy for me, or I thought he had, and he had asked to see the document before anyone else so he could help me scan for mistakes, and I had gladly given him, thinking he was doing it because he loved me. Well, the day finally came. Normally in the company, it's only the managers of each team that are allowed to pitch for any new project they want to work on. But there was always one day in 3 months where even the least of workers were allowed to present their ideas to the company. And if the idea had been good, the worker gets automatic promotion and also allowed to have a team to work with on the idea. I had been so excited when that day came, and I hadn't even slept through the night trying to perfect my speech. And David had borne the brunt of that because he had been my audience through the night. So when the time finally came, I had been shocked when Jim had presented my idea in the exact way, without even removing any part or changing it. I remember vividly that I had run out of the meeting without properly excusing myself, and I had gone into the bathroom and cried my eyes out. I was so upset that I hadn't even stayed until the end of the day before leaving. When David had seen me and had asked, I had just lied that I was feeling sick, and he had asked if I had been able to pitch, but I had just told him I had been too sick to do so I had handed it over to my manager. What could I have said? I couldn't exactly tell him that I was actually seeing Jim, and I had foolishly handed him my proposal to look through, only for him to use it. The next day was the weekend, thankfully, so I did not have to go to work. So I laid in bed, mopping my tears and licking my wounds. David had had work, so he had regretfully left me alone, which I was thankful for. But he had cooked and bought me some medications before leaving. My phone kept ringing, and they were all from Jim. I did not pick any of his calls, and he texted too, telling me how sorry he was and that he wanted to explain in person why he did what he did. I decided to go meet him to hear him out. Perhaps he had some really unselfish reasons for doing what he did. So I had gone, and Jim had gotten on his knees and begged me for forgiveness and had promised never to do such again. He had told me it was because he had wanted a promotion for so long after years of being a manager, and my proposal had been so good he had gotten greedy. He also promised that he would definitely help me get promoted after he was officially promoted. I believed him. In fact, at that point, I was happy he would get the promotion he had craved for years, and it would all be because of me. I forgave him, and we went back to our usual. Jim and I were together for 2 years before it was suddenly announced that Jim was getting married to our boss's daughter. To say I was shocked was an understatement. I couldn't believe my ears. He was getting married, but not to me, but to our boss's daughter. I was so pained and angry that I stopped taking his calls, but he kept pleading for a chance to explain himself, and eventually I met up with him. He then told me that it was actually the boss who brought the proposition up and that he couldn't have said no to our boss. He went ahead to convince me it was me he actually truly wanted and that he could never love her. I stupidly believed him, and we continued seeing each other. And within a month of the announcement, Jim got married to her. But that did not stop our secret meetups from taking place. So I was literally having an affair with a married man. But at that point, I didn't mind. I was so in love with Jim, I did not care what anybody thought or that it was morally wrong. David found out eventually that I was seeing a married man, and he had told me to end things with him, but I hadn't listened. Well, until I got pregnant for Jim. Jim had flipped when I told him I was pregnant. He had said that he couldn't have a baby with me just yet, especially because his marriage was still new and all. He gave all sorts of excuses and had offered me money to abort the baby. It had been then my eyes cleared, and I started to see Jim for who he really had been all along, a liar, cheat, and manipulator. I left his hotel room and cried all the way home, and when I'd gotten home, David had been there waiting for me because of how late into the night it was. As soon as I saw David, I just burst out in tears again, and David had rushed to comfort me. After several minutes of just sitting in David's arms and sobbing while he soothed me, I had leaned over, caught his face in my hands, and kissed him. David had been surprised and taken aback and tried to avoid it, but I had not been ready to listen to anything, and I begged him to take me to bed. David eventually agreed. I knew he wanted me as he had always done over the years, so it had been easy to persuade him I wanted to have sex, not only for emotional comfort. Weeks after the sex with David, I was still behaving weirdly to him because I did not know what to make of our relationship, and I hadn't wanted to give him hope of things developing between us. That day, I had decided to clean my room since it was the weekend, so I had done the cleaning up and was resting when David rushed into my room holding something that was quite dirty. It was obvious he picked it from the trash can, and I had looked at him, disgusted. He hadn't minded the look I gave him and instead had tears in his eyes and had asked me if it was true. I looked at him, confused, and when I leaned closely to look at what was in his hands, it turned out to be the pregnancy test kit I bought, and I had tested positive. It was obvious from the look in David's eyes that he thought the baby was his because of the sex we had a few weeks ago. I knew I was making a very big mistake, but I thought immediately, right there staring into David's expectant eyes, that David would be a good father for my child, and I did not even have to raise it as a single mother as I had planned to. So I nodded and told him I was really pregnant, expecting him to ask the next obvious question if it was his, but David hadn't done that. Instead, he had gotten down on his knees after making happy sounds and pounding the air with his fist, and had proposed marriage to me without a ring. I had been surprised because I had certainly not expected that from him, but I had said yes, and later that day, David had taken me out with him to purchase a ring, and we had called our parents to announce that we were getting married. They had been really excited because it meant their lifelong dream was coming to pass. Everything had progressed quickly, and within a month, we were married. When Jim heard I was getting married, he had called and left me different messages, but I hadn't replied to any of them, and I eventually blocked him. I knew he had only wanted to confirm if I had aborted the baby, and I hadn't wanted to deal with him at that point. David had always been a good friend right from diapers, but he was better as a husband. He was really sweet, paid attention to me, and he never missed the doctor's appointments to check if the babies were all right. Yes, I had twins. We agreed that since I was carrying 2 babies, working was not an option, so I quit my job and started staying at home. Our apartment then was big, but definitely not big enough for 2 babies, so we had to get a new and bigger apartment. David had used up all his savings and also took out a mortgage so he could buy a house with the hopes that within a year and a half, he'd be done with the payment. I gave birth to my babies, Sam and Sarah, and because I almost developed a complication while in labor, I had to be operated on to save my life and that of the babies. David had gotten another loan to pay for the medical bills and everything so we could go home. All the sacrifices he made me fall in love with him before I even realized it myself. He was an unselfish person and lover, and the way he adored our kids was just everything. He never even doubted the paternity of the kids, even though if it were according to calculations, I should have given birth 2 months later. But David did not even mind all that, and he loved the kids and me greatly. David had to sell the land his father had given him as a gift, so he could pay back the money he got to clear off our medical bills. So it was only the mortgage we were to pay back, except things did not happen exactly how we planned because David's company had a major financial setback, and they had to sell the company to another firm, and more than half of the staff were asked to go. David was not let go, though, but their pay was slashed into halves, and that meant paying back the loan on the house also took more than half of the money he earned. I couldn't work because of the twins. David had also insisted I didn't, so we could put an eye on them, especially at that crucial point of raising them. Instead of the year and a half calculated for the mortgage payment, it became 3 years. It was not easy for us, and I started to get really frustrated with everything happening. I advised David several times to quit the job and find something else, but he had refused because he thought that there were really no better jobs anywhere too. David never complained about his new boss, but from how I saw things, the boss was always insulting and degrading his workers, especially David, and it made me really agitated. I hated the way David would scurry out of the house whenever his boss called to come get him when he was too drunk to drive himself home, or how the boss would win Best Architect of the Year while it was David doing all the work. I felt insulted on David's behalf, especially because I knew he was still there because he did not want us starving. And one time I had suggested going to our parents for the money, and David had flipped. He did not want our parents involved in our financial problems, and he'd rather receive more insults and work to get the money than do that. It pissed me off, and we would fight several times over it. Each time, David would apologize, but still remained firm in his decision. Eventually, I decided to go meet Jim to pay off the mortgage. I thought to threaten him with his kids. Luckily, I had not deleted his contacts. I only blocked him, so I unblocked him, and I had texted him for us to meet up. Jim had agreed almost immediately to meet up. He probably thought I missed us and wanted to rekindle old flames. We met in secret as we usually did before. He booked a hotel room and texted me the address, and I had gone to meet up with him. Luckily, the kids were with their grandparents for the weekend, and David had gone on an errand out of town for his boss, so I had the chance to sneak away without being caught. On getting there, I had immediately told Jim the reason I was there. He had been shocked at first that I kept the babies and that I had married another man, knowing fully well that the babies weren't his. Then he agreed to give me the money to pay off the mortgage and even more to take care of the kids under the condition that the kids would never know he was their father, and I was cool with that, so I agreed. But Jim started to talk about how much he missed me and how miserable he was in his marriage, and that he was glad I was the mother of his kids. I was happy he felt miserable in his marriage because it somehow made me satisfied that he did not cheat me and get away with it totally. Jim kept going on and on about missing me and how everything had been without me in his life, and I had fallen for it. We ended up having sex that evening before I left his hotel room. I regretted cheating on David, and I felt really guilty. And I decided that once Jim sent the money for the mortgage payment, I would never speak to him again. But Jim did not send the money. I waited for days but did not receive the money, so I had to call and ask to meet again. He agreed eagerly, and when I confronted him about the money, he had told me he had purposely not sent it because he knew that if he had, I would never have wanted to see him again. He made me promise to always meet up with him whenever he wanted if I wanted the money, and I was so desperate at that point that I agreed to his terms. He gave me the money, and instead of doing what I had planned to do with the money in the first place, I did not. For the first time in my life, that much money was sitting pretty in my account, and I thought of all the beautiful things I could buy with it. And besides, how would I explain to David where the money came from? So I decided to keep the money selfishly for myself. And the money kept increasing because any time I met with Jim, he gave me money. I felt cheap and used because it felt like he was paying me for the sex, but I had no choice but to continue with it. David was mostly too exhausted from running silly errands for his boss to notice my suspicious movements, and it relieved me that he didn't. But he did notice my change of wardrobe. I was starting to buy glamorous dresses that I could originally not afford before, and I changed the kids' wardrobe too. When David had asked where I got money from to get it, I had lied that a distant cousin had sent them for us and the kids, and he had asked who the distant cousin was since we practically grew up together, and he had seen no one like that before. I had lied that we had just reconnected and that my parents probably would not even remember her, and David had kept quiet about it. David's 32nd birthday came, and I bought him a cake, made dinner, and also bought him 2 suits to replace the almost shabby ones he wore to work. David had refused the gifts because he kept pestering me to tell him where I got the money to get the expensive suits. I got really angry and did not speak to him for days. He later apologized for not accepting the gift, but he was still stubborn about accepting the suits. One time, one of the twins, Sarah, got really sick and needed a blood transfusion, and I began to panic. I offered to be the donor, but I had a history of low sugar levels, so I was not allowed to. David had offered to, and I knew that my whole secret was about to be exposed, so I had refused blatantly, giving different stupid excuses for it. Eventually, they had been able to get a donor for Sarah, and that settled it, and I had been really glad it got sorted out that way. I continued my affair with Jim, and he continued to pay me for the sex. David was still working for that annoying company and slaving around, which pissed me off. So eventually the boss had won another award again, despite the fact that it was David's designs and work that actually won. But as usual, the boss took the credit for it all, and David had kept quiet about it. Anyway, the boss decided to host a party to celebrate the award he won, and all the workers had been allowed to bring a guest with them. David was the one who did most of the work planning the party on short notice. He had asked me to go to the party with him, and I had accepted because I hadn't wanted him to go alone, looking like a loser again. But I had forced him to wear one of the suits I got him for his birthday. I had bought a killer dress so I could show them who was boss at the party. I hated the way they degraded David, and I wanted to show them that his wife was not someone they could look down on too. Prior to the day of the party, we had dropped off the twins at their grandparents' place, so we did not have to bother about who was babysitting them when it was time for the party. David had had to go alone to the party because he had been called that there had been a problem with delivering the food, which meant I had to meet him at the party instead of leaving together as planned. When I got to the party, I first saw David serving some guest drinks, and I had been infuriated by the sight of it. I had purposely walked towards him and removed the drinks from his hand, and had asked him sweetly if he was going to enjoy the party and not be a workaholic for once. The people at the table had been shocked, and I had been happy, but David had frowned, and I had just smiled sweetly and greeted the people at the table and introduced myself as David's wife. One of them, who was unusually loud and arrogant, had asked me to join them at the table, and with the way David tensed beside me, I had guessed it was the boss that was always ordering him around. I accepted the offer and sat, therefore forcing David to sit too. David was rather tense throughout while his boss and the others at the table laughed at stupid jokes, and he even made jokes about David. I was angry and just stared at them with pure hatred. Well, just until two more people joined the table, and David's boss had gotten up to greet the person warmly. When I looked up, I had been very shocked to discover it was actually Jim and his wife who joined the table. It had been my turn to become tense. David's boss then asked David to pour Jim a drink, and I had never felt so embarrassed in my life, especially because Jim kept looking at me stylishly, and he was grinning. He had been enjoying the moment. I had been so upset and bothered, and I later excused myself to use the restroom. Jim's wife had come in moments later after me, and I had become tense again, trying to avoid her when she had smiled at me sweetly. She had introduced herself as Kara. I had only ever known her as Jim's wife. I never really found out about her name or anything about her in particular. We discussed a few general things right there, and she seemed like a really good person. Not at all like the monster Jim had painted her to be. And I started to feel guilty for believing a conniving bastard like Jim and helping him cheat on such a lovely person like Kara. Curiously, I had asked Kara how she and Jim had met, and she had told me that Jim was actually the one who pursued her without giving her a chance to reject him, and that he had proposed marriage 2 months after dating. I had been very shocked because that had not been the story Jim had told me. We eventually left the restroom and went back to the table, only to hear all the others teasing David for being a poor guy. And the most infuriating part was that Jim and David's boss did most of the teasing, while David just sat there and poured their drinks. I had been so upset and angry that I had not even known I shouted angrily at David to stop being pathetic and get his money up. Everyone looked startled and stared at me like I had grown 2 heads, even Kara. David had just looked at me, stood up, and left without a word, and I went with him. I've tried to explain several times why I blurted that out in anger, but David is not even listening to me. He hardly stays at home now, so there's barely any chance to have any conversations with him. Please, guys, what do I do? I cannot lose David. I really do love him. Please. Update. Hello, Reddit. These past couple of months have been dreadful for me. I've cried so hard that I've started to feel like there's no more tears left in my tear ducts. But every time my brain decides to replay that particular day again, I just find fresh tears dropping from my eyes. David actually found out. He found out that the twins weren't his. Apparently, he had secretly done a DNA test after the way I reacted when I hadn't wanted him to be the blood donor for Sarah. He had walked into the house that day and had slapped the document hard on the table right beside me, and with red eyes, asked who the father of our kids was. I tried to deny the allegations, but David was having none of it, and he had shouted at me angrily. I had told him who it was. I had been so scared of the way he was looking at me that I had actually just gone on my knees and cried while blurting out everything. David had just kept quiet, listening to me, and when I started to plead for his forgiveness, he had just turned away and left the house. This time, he never came back. Our parents found out about everything, not because David told them, but because I did, so they could help me at least plead with David. But that was not the case. Now everyone's back is against me. I am all alone and I have no one by me. Jim is also ruined, by the way. I had texted Jim angrily and tried blaming him for everything, but his phone had apparently been with his wife, and now she is filing for a divorce and not leaving him a penny. The nasty things you guys have said regarding my post also made me realize more how stupid I've been. I kept blaming David's boss for the nasty way he treated him, and yet I did the same to him too. I hurt David even more than his boss ever did. David suffered through all those insults because of my kids and me, and yet all I did was stab him, not in the back this time, but right in the chest. My parents have taken the kids away from me, and they want no sort of contact from me at all. So even my kids are not mine anymore. I've sent numerous texts and called several times to apologize for what I did to David, but he just would not even hear me out. He quit his job at that company and moved away, and I don't even know where he's moved to. I really feel so stupid for all the hurt I caused David.